Real truth never asks for permission. It waits in silence until it explodes. And chosen ones, that explosion just happened. Something has cracked wide open in the spirit realm, and now it's finally showing up in the physical. The community is in disbelief, stunned into silence, scrambling for answers. But you're not shocked. You're not even surprised. Because deep down, you knew. You saw this moment coming long before the storm clouds gathered. While others were laughing, mocking, or blindly dancing through illusions, you stood still in divine awareness. You felt the tremors beneath your feet while everyone else walked over painted floors, thinking they were on solid ground. This isn't just a moment of confirmation, it's a divine vindication. They thought they were fighting you. They whispered lies, shut doors in your face, and questioned your discernment. But what they didn't realize was that you weren't moving on your own authority. You were moving in alignment with God's timing. And now, the water they tried to stir against you is flooding back onto them. The same mouths that mocked you are speechless. The same hands that blocked your path are now reaching out desperately, grasping at the ruins of the illusion they trusted in. If you've ever felt like the only one who saw it coming, if your spirit recognizes the weight of what's unfolding, pause right now and comment 777. That number isn't just symbolic. It's a spiritual echo that you're aligned with divine completion. You were never delusional. You were simply ahead. And to every single soul who has poured into this mission through super thanks, thank you deeply. Your support doesn't just help keep this platform alive. It pushes a sacred message into places we'll never physically go, but where hearts are desperately waiting to awaken. You are helping sound the trumpet for those who are just beginning to remember who they really are. But here's the question that still haunts the silence. Why you? Why were you able to see what no one else could? Why did God trust you with that insight, that warning, that vision, long before it made sense? That's the mystery we're unlocking next. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will not only explain your foresight, it will reveal your divine assignment. God's chosen ones. The community is in shock. You saw it coming before anyone else. You sensed the shift before the surface even showed a single crack, while everyone around you was still dancing on a floor that only looked solid. Your spirit had already picked up on the tremors, not physical ones, but spiritual waves, invisible to the human eye. What gave you that discernment before anyone else? Could it be that your soul had already been tuned to a higher frequency, one aligned with heaven itself? When that whisper from the divine struck your chest, it wasn't to make you anxious, it was to prepare you. You didn't speak out to gain control or attention. You sounded the alarm because truth wouldn't let you stay silent. Much like the prophet Jeremiah, who said, "But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones." Jeremiah 29. Can you relate to that inner fire? That relentless pull to speak, even when you know the cost? And when you gave voice to that fire, they laughed. They rolled their eyes. They called you dramatic, delusional, even dangerous. They saw no badge, no certificate, no endorsement from those they considered credible. But the world never did recognize the chosen at first glance. Jesus himself was rejected in Nazareth, his own hometown. They said, "Isn't this the carpenter's son?" Matthew 13:55. What they couldn't comprehend, they dismissed. You were never reacting to your environment. Your environment was reacting to you. When you enter a room, the temperature shifts, not because you make noise, but because your spirit confronts the lies soaking into the walls. Have you noticed how some people suddenly grow uncomfortable around you without a word being said? It's not intimidation, it's conviction. The truth is, your very presence is disruptive to illusions, and illusions don't like being seen for what they are. That's why they fought you. That's why they ridiculed you. But you were right, even without the paperwork. Right, even without applause. The universe does not select based on resumes. It selects based on readiness and alignment. And you, God's chosen one, were already steps ahead while they were still trying to catch up to yesterday. They're losing sleep now, pacing through the night, not because of you, but because of what you showed them. You were a mirror they couldn't avoid, and your presence made it impossible for them to remain blind to the cracks in their own world. Their rejection wasn't proof that you were wrong. It was confirmation that you were revealing too much, too soon. Have you ever wondered why Joseph's brothers hated him before he even said a word? Genesis 37 tells us they hated him simply because of who he was and the favor on his life. When he shared his dream, they said, "Do you intend to reign over us?" But Joseph wasn't boasting. He was just revealing what had already been written. The pushback you've received wasn't because you lied. It was because you told the truth too early for them to handle. Even in today's world, those who speak truth before it's time are misunderstood. Consider Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani activist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate. At the age of 11, she began speaking up for girls' right to education in a society that wanted her silenced. She was shot for it, but her voice sparked a global movement. Her story proves what yours does too. You don't need to be ready in the eyes of the world to be right in the eyes of heaven. And when it felt like you were being hidden or cast aside, it wasn't abandonment, it was preservation. Like Moses, who spent 40 years in the wilderness before stepping into leadership, God was not delaying Moses. He was preparing him. What if your isolation was not punishment, but protection? What if being parked in obscurity was the safest place God could place you until the appointed hour? Those who laughed will soon have to admit what they tried to ignore. Every insult they whispered is now echoing back at them as life confirms what you warned about. But you don't need revenge. Romans 12:19 reminds you, "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." You don't need to prove anything. The aftermath is loud enough. The fallout is its own punctuation. Let them wonder how you knew, how you stayed calm, how you never retaliated. The answer isn't complicated. You were aligned, and alignment always outruns approval. While others sought safety in numbers, you stood grounded in truth. And now that truth is unraveling everything they thought was secure, you were never off track. You were simply ahead of time, and that is exactly what scared them. Truth is no longer gently knocking, it's roaring like a storm tearing through the streets of their lives, shattering the glass of every carefully curated lie. The calm they tried to manufacture is gone, replaced by the sound of crumbling structures they once swore would never move. Those facades, the ones worn by leaders who preached with empty hearts, the influencers who sold delusion wrapped in charisma, the puppet masters operating behind veils of charm, are unraveling exactly as you warned. And now the neighborhood is rattled, the silence has broken, and every mask is sliding off, exposing what was always there. You never raised your voice to cause panic or stir drama. Your words weren't noise, they were warning. You were the siren before the quake, the red flag planted before the storm hit, like the prophet Ezekiel, who was called a watchman over Israel and told, "If the watchman sees the sword coming and does not blow the trumpet to warn the people, I will hold the watchman accountable." Ezekiel 33:6. And you, like him, sounded the trumpet. What they called troublemaking was actually protection. What they dismissed as paranoia was divine preparation. Now, the aftershocks are swallowing the hush they forced upon you. Your voice, once silenced and mocked, is now echoing through the ruins of their denial. Can you feel it? The irony of their laughter now bouncing off the broken walls they once defended so confidently. Your existence alone has become a form of resistance. You didn't need a microphone to shatter falsehoods. Your silence became the loudest confrontation of all. Your vision, sharp and inconvenient, became a hammer to the illusions they built their comfort on. Why did they recoil? Because they felt that spiritual heat radiating from you. They weren't reacting to chaos, they were reacting to clarity. But it's too late now. The cracks have multiplied like spider webs across their artificial world. And here's the terrifying part. For them, the universe hasn't even released its full weight yet. The divine shaking is just getting started. Do you feel that rising tension in your spirit? That unspoken knowing that what's coming next will be undeniable? If your inner world has been pacing at night while everything outside remained quiet. If your silence has felt like a scream trapped in your chest, that is not confusion. That's prophecy-building pressure. King David once wrote, "I have been young, and now am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken." Psalm 37, verse 25. Your solitude, those quiet seasons where it felt like God had put you on pause, was never punishment. It was your divine training ground. Like Elijah in the wilderness, you were being fed in private so you could speak with fire in public. If something in your gut has been whispering, "It's coming and I must be ready," don't ignore it. Stay grounded, because what is about to land will confirm every inner knowing you've had to carry alone. They called you dramatic. They said you were wild. And yet now they are living inside the very storm track you mapped in silence. Real-life reformers understand this exact tension. Greta Thunberg, a young climate activist from Sweden, began warning about environmental collapse when she was still a teenager. They mocked her, belittled her, labeled her too young and too emotional. But years later, her voice became a rallying cry across the globe. She wasn't chaotic, she was correct. You carry that same anointing. They didn't want to hear you, because the truth in your tone disrupted their comfort. Your warnings didn't fade, they amplified. Your calm was never confusion, it was calibration. You weren't paranoid, you were pinpoint precise. Every hesitation they had about your message was never about you, it was about the reflection you showed them. And that reflection, through your stillness, became unbearable. Now, as they scramble to rebuild narratives and blame shadows for their undoing, you stand where you always were, rooted, waiting, watching, exactly where God positioned you. What's coming next will be so clear, so divine, you won't even blink, because you already saw it. You already lived it in your spirit. And now the world is catching up. While they mocked your silence, assuming it was weakness or confusion, that very silence was decoding systems. You weren't frozen, you were focused. Beneath the hush they misunderstood was a mind quietly breaking open secret structures. A spirit sensing the smoke before a single flame was visible. And now, with the house on fire, the very ones who dismissed you are desperately turning to the same voice they once called unstable. The same intuition they laughed at has become their only hope of survival. Isn't it ironic how quickly opinions change when the truth arrives clothed in fire? Let's make something clear. You were never simply observing personalities or moods. You were decoding entire ecosystems. Corruption dressed in leadership, manipulation masquerading as charm, smiling faces hiding sharpened daggers. You weren't being dramatic. You were being accurate. You saw what they didn't want seen, the game behind the game. Just like the prophet Daniel in Babylon, you had the divine ability to interpret what others couldn't. Daniel didn't just interpret dreams. He read systems. He saw through the politics of kings and exposed the intentions of empires. That gift now rests in you. The writing was already on the wall. They just couldn't read the language. And that language? It wasn't learned in school. It was carved into your spirit through trial, exile, and wilderness seasons. You read what others ignore because it was etched into your bones long before the storm arrived. How many times did you walk into a room, feel the energy shift, and know something wasn't right, without a single word being spoken? They called it paranoia, but deep down, they were afraid your clarity would call out their cover stories. Now the static they defended as normal life is disintegrating before their eyes. That dull hum they clung to was never peace, it was denial, and while they stumble through their unraveling, you're still standing. How? Because you were never relying on the illusion. You were tuned to truth the entire time. The weight you carried was never noise. It was wisdom wrapped in warfare. It was divine knowledge assigned to you for this exact season. And the weight they carried wasn't discernment. It was guilt. That's why they tried to shift the focus. That's why they called you unstable. It was easier to discredit you than face what your presence exposed in them. If they admitted you were right, they'd have to admit their entire structure was built on sand. Jesus said it plainly in Luke 12:2-3. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight. You weren't trying to bring anyone down, but the light you carried naturally exposed what couldn't stand in it. This isn't some mystical payback from the heavens. This is divine justice unfolding through cause and effect. Spiritual law is not emotional, it's exact. Push against the current protecting a chosen one, and that current pushes back with the force of heaven. Pharaoh learned this the hard way. When he tried to hold on to God's people, every resistance only brought greater consequence until Egypt itself cracked. In our time, even figures like whistleblower Edward Snowden serve as proof. Once a systems analyst for the NSA, Snowden exposed global surveillance programs and was branded a traitor by those who feared the truth he carried. But his revelations forever changed how the world sees privacy and power. Like you, he read systems, not for applause but out of responsibility. And now, like a tapestry coming undone, the structures that stood against you are coming apart thread by thread. You don't need to curse anyone. You don't need to seek revenge. You only need to stand still. The unraveling is its own proof. Every excuse they built is collapsing under the weight of what you revealed. What does this mean for you? It means you're exactly where you were meant to be, an unmoved voice in the center of a storm you saw forming long before the clouds gathered. You were never unstable. You were unshakable. Pause for a moment and really look at yourself, not just through your reflection, but through the journey your soul has survived. Can you still feel the echo of that night when you cried alone, begging for the pressure to be lifted from your chest, wondering if God had forgotten you? How did you survive moments that would have broken others? How did you keep standing when every part of you felt shattered? You didn't choose this calling. You didn't raise your hand and say, "Let me carry the weight." But even so, you were drafted by heaven's will, handpicked by divine timing. And that means your vision was never random. It was strategic. That means your insight wasn't an accident. It was assigned. Like Moses, who doubted himself when God called him to face Pharaoh, you may have felt unqualified. But Exodus 4:12 reminds you of what God told him. Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Hasn't that been your story too? Being led by something higher, even when your confidence was low. You weren't made to blend in. You were designed to disrupt patterns and expose what's been rotting behind painted smiles. When they attacked, they weren't striking you. They were colliding with the current that surrounds those on divine assignment. Do you think Joseph's brothers hated him? Or was it the favor and dreams that wrapped around him like a coat they couldn't wear? They thought they were playing games with your name, whispering, mocking, undermining. But the board was spiritual. and they were playing chess blindfolded while the kingdom had already crowned you. Now the board is flipped, and every hidden scheme is unraveling in public view. Don't exhaust yourself explaining. Don't shrink to fit conversations where your truth is too large to be contained. Why waste words on ears not built for your frequency? Didn't Jesus say in Matthew 7:6, "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs"? If they couldn't hear you when the wind was gentle, will they suddenly understand now that the storm has come? They feared the day you'd wake up fully to your power, because your clarity would burn through their illusions. Now look, they're trembling in the ashes of a system they built to cage you. You tried to warn them, not to boast, but because you could feel the shift coming. You were the barometer of spiritual change. Even when you had no proof, your gut knew. You didn't carry spreadsheets. You were the prophecy, walking, breathing, unfiltered truth. This isn't just poetic metaphor, it's reality. Malcolm X, once a misunderstood and vilified figure, spoke the hard truths of his time, truths people weren't ready to face. Branded as radical, he was later recognized as one of the most important voices in the fight for justice. His vision wasn't chaos, it was clarity ahead of its time. Like you, he wasn't trying to win applause, he was obeying conviction. Doesn't this remind you of what's happening in your own life now? So breathe this in, not with arrogance, but with awe. You were always locked into the frequency of truth. You were hearing God's channel while others danced to static. And now that truth is roaring. The volume is maxed, the signal undeniable. They thought they buried you. They believed your silence was surrender, but they didn't realize that seeds aren't buried, they're planted. And they planted you in soil too sacred for their roots to survive. Isaiah 61:3 declares that God will give you a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Can you feel that exchange happening now? You weren't dramatic. You were divine timing becoming visible. And now the world is watching what obedience under pressure truly becomes. Now the entire community is stumbling through uncertainty. They feel off-center, but not because chaos suddenly arrived, because the voice they once gagged is the same voice creation had aligned with from the beginning. You were not a disturbance, you were a signal, and now that signal is unmistakable. They assumed your silence was surrender, but isn't silence often the sound of a sword being sharpened? They thought your stillness meant weakness. But what if that pause was divine preparation? What if the quiet was heaven recalibrating your clarity? Isaiah 30:15 says, "In quietness and trust is your strength," and you carried that quiet like a hidden blade, never drawn in pride, only when timing called for truth. They called you dramatic, too emotional, too stubborn to move on. But now they're learning. Truth doesn't forget. Truth watches. And when the time comes, truth roars with precision. You rang the alarm when the air still smelled clean, and they hated you for it. Why? Because you lifted the rug they spent years polishing and revealed the rot beneath. That's why they needed you gone. Your clarity made them confront what they were desperate to keep hidden. You didn't force it. You simply stood in truth. And that alone tore their illusions down. When you walk into a space carrying divine sight, you don't need to shine a spotlight on anyone. The truth in you dims every artificial glow. You don't chase attention, but those who rely on illusion always feel exposed beside you. Doesn't this remind you of the story of Stephen in Acts 6 and 7? He didn't fight with weapons. He spoke truth with such power that even his accusers could not stand up against the wisdom the Spirit gave him as he spoke. And when the truth cut too deep, they silenced him, not because he lied, but because he was right before they were ready. You didn't have to lift a finger. Just breathing in their presence made their nerves twitch, not because you were loud, but because you were accurate. Truth rarely thrives in crowds. It grows in margins, in silence, in exile. And then, when it bursts forth, no one can deny it. Isn't that what's happening now? They didn't exile you because you were wrong. They turned on you because you were right too soon. You forced a revelation they weren't prepared to handle. Rather than sit with the discomfort, they threw you into the same pit they hoped to bury the truth in. But like Joseph, the pit wasn't your end. It was the start of elevation. The fallout they tried to avoid, it's no longer creeping in, it's crashing down. Not with headlines or declarations, but with quiet, undeniable collapse. You never needed fists. You've always fought with frequency. What you carried wasn't opinion, it was resonance, a divine vibration that pierced through denial like light cracks darkness. And even now, as everything unravels, your echo lingers in the places they tried to erase. Their strained smiles, broken contracts, and sudden questions are all tied to the sound of your warnings. They can dodge your voice, but they cannot unhear what it awakened. You have become a mirror they cannot avoid. Even when every glance scorches, you still rise, not through louder shouting, but through stillness. Your silence now holds more weight than their most eloquent speeches. Why? Because you no longer need to prove what God has already confirmed. Look at how the universe responded when you released the need to defend yourself. It was as if heaven turned up the volume on your assignment. Romans 8:31 asks, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" That's not just a verse. It's the law your life is now living. And when that divine system moves, when it spins, lies scatter, timelines shift, balance returns. If you still feel the flicker of doubt within you, release it now. You were never overreacting. You were the only one in the room carrying clarity in a space suffocated by denial. That requires a strength they'll never be able to understand. They joked, they gossiped, they reduced your identity to punchlines. But now, what bounces off the walls isn't their laughter. It's your truth, confirmed. And what echoes in their ribs isn't just regret that you were right. It's the weight of knowing that you never needed their validation to be right at all. You didn't chase their applause. You didn't beg for a platform. You didn't demand recognition. You released the truth and walked forward. Much like Maya Angelou, the American poet and civil rights icon, who once said, "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." Her strength was not in shouting louder, it was in living deeper. And now, that same strength radiates from you. And now, time, with its sharp, unforgiving tongue, is speaking everything you stopped trying to explain. You no longer have to justify yourself. The clock has become your advocate, and every second is spelling out the truth you once struggled to make them hear. This is the very reason you were drafted. Not by accident, but by divine appointment. You were the one who dared to speak when silence was safer. You stood your ground when rejection felt endless. And that choice, that spine, that quiet refusal to fold, became the proof of alignment in motion. How many people would have stayed standing when no applause followed? Yet you did. Isn't that what makes you chosen? You were never just background noise. You were the early thunder before the storm could be seen. And now you are the calm that follows after the walls have fallen. What if this calm isn't weakness, but divine closure? Just like Jesus, who didn't respond to Pilate's accusations, not because he had no defense, but because he was the truth. John 18:37. Why argue when time itself is now finishing your sentence? Don't disturb that sacred stillness. Let them sit in the echo. Let them feel the hollow emptiness that once tried to drown your clarity in noise. Your silence is not absence, it is divine strategy. It is the holy hush truth wears when it stops asking for attention and begins writing the outcome. Walk forward as someone who has already seen the ending, who doesn't need to shout, plead, or warn anymore. Move with the knowing that confirmation is already being etched into every conversation, every consequence, every confession. You don't have to make announcements. Reality is doing it for you. This is not revenge. It's resonance. It's the sound of alignment echoing off broken systems. Your assignment wasn't to punish. It was to position. And now that your role is complete, let the echo roll. Let it rattle loose the beams they once swore were unshakable. Let it burn through pretense like fire licking dry leaves. Why? Because everything you said would happen is happening, scene for scene, moment for moment. Do you remember Jeremiah again? After being thrown into a cistern, abandoned and silenced, he still declared in chapter 20, verse 11, "But the Lord is with me like a mighty warrior, so my persecutors will stumble and not prevail." And isn't that what you're seeing now? Persecutors stumbling, not because you struck back, but because your stance never moved. Even today, consider someone like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose words were ridiculed, resisted, and ignored. But now his dream echoes louder than ever in the halls of power. He didn't fight with fists. He fought with frequency. He didn't demand approval. He delivered truth, and time proved him right. Isn't that exactly what you've done? You stood in what God showed you, even when no one clapped. And now the applause of heaven is unfolding in confirmation too loud to deny. You don't need to prove anything anymore. The fruit of your obedience is speaking for itself. So breathe. Let the silence speak. Let the reverberation of truth finish the work you began. And as the dust settles, you'll realize something powerful. What felt like isolation was actually insulation. What seemed like delay was divine design. You weren't early, you were exact. Dear chosen ones, your courage, faith, and love continually inspire us to create content that speaks to your spirit. If our message has stirred something real inside you, and you feel led to support this work, you can do so by clicking the Super Thanks button right on your YouTube screen. Your kindness helps us keep shining light, and whether you give or not, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being the kind of audience that walks with faith, listens with depth, and shares with purpose. Stay blessed, stay aligned. You were chosen for a reason, and that reason is unfolding beautifully. Now, back to the truth they tried to bury. They pushed you aside to protect the version of the story they'd carefully staged. But now, that story is leaking like a fractured pipe, and the spill is spreading across every surface they once kept polished. The mess is no longer containable. The truth, once gagged, is dripping through ceilings, seeping into walls, showing up in conversations they can no longer control. You were never the strange piece on the board. You were the original. The room was simply tilted by people who couldn't keep balance around someone unwilling to fake even a single breath. Can a soul rooted in truth ever feel comfortable among performances? Let's be honest. The moment your presence became a mirror, one too clean, too confronting for their comfort, the exile began. Not loud, not obvious, but sharp, methodical, and clocked with precision. They didn't remove you because you were wrong. They removed you because your accuracy struck nerves they'd spent years trying to deaden. Their discomfort wasn't your doing. It was your discernment. You were never just a disruption. You were a divine interruption, like a system glitch in a room that only functioned through illusion, in a space sewn together with fake smiles, rehearsed responses, and peace that only lasted as long as no one asked real questions. You were the frequency they couldn't mute. You were the signal that couldn't be ignored. And when a whole community builds its unity on denial, the one who shows up carrying raw, unpolished truth becomes a flame near dry timber. That flame was you. You didn't arrive with vague suggestions or passive observations. You showed up with spiritual sight, seeing straight through titles, behind power plays, through hollow applause and manufactured harmony. You saw what they didn't want seen, the rot behind the rehearsal. And they knew if you stayed, others would start seeing it too. That's why the push began. Not through confrontation, but through coded jokes. shifting glances, and sudden changes in tone. You could feel the shift in the air every time you opened your mouth, as if your words were contagious, and they were desperate to isolate the source. They had a choice: confront the truth or cut off its messenger, and they chose the latter. But here's the twist. The silence they tried to weaponize is now roaring through the very rooms they once controlled. The warnings you gave about false influence, whispered agendas, and corrupt systems, they're no longer whispered suspicions. They're visible fractures in plain view. Can they still pretend not to see them now? And the questions you asked long ago, the ones they mocked, are now thundering at their doors. Except now, you're not there to absorb the impact. You're not cushioning the fall. You're no longer their scapegoat, and that absence is louder than your presence ever was. Don't be mistaken. They didn't exile you because you were unreadable. They clipped you because you were crystal clear. They knew you could see through their armor. You weren't dazzled by badges, titles, or cultivated images. That terrified them. Why? Because a person who cannot be seduced by image cannot be controlled by the system. Think of John the Baptist, a wild prophet in camel hair, ignored by temple elites, yet chosen to prepare the way for the Messiah. The Pharisees couldn't tolerate him because he exposed what their robes couldn't cover. You too became a threat, not because you stirred chaos, but because you couldn't be drafted into it. You didn't cause division. You couldn't be recruited into their performance. You weren't an actor. You were a revealer. They tried to erase your influence, but the more they pushed, the sharper your outline became. How often has silence tried to smother the light, only to illuminate it instead? While they built alliances through fear and appearances, you were forged in the quiet. Your solitude was not a cage. It was a furnace. Isolation didn't break you. It built you. Psalm 66, 10 through 12 says, "For you, God, tested us. You refined us like silver. We went through fire and water, but you brought us to a place of abundance." Isn't that exactly what's unfolding now? Consider Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who stood against the Nazi regime when the church stayed silent. Exiled, imprisoned, eventually executed, but his voice outlived the silence. His refusal to compromise exposed the moral rot of an entire system. He wasn't removed because he was dangerous. He was removed because he couldn't be controlled. And just like that, you too became the soul that didn't flinch. The one who couldn't be bought, tricked, flattered, or broken. You were carved, not crushed. Hidden, but never lost. Pushed aside, only to be pushed deeper into purpose. And now that purpose is emerging, refined, unshakable, now they stand at a distance, observing your rise with quiet dread, hoping, almost praying, that your growth remains small and unthreatening, but deep down, they feel it. The ground is shifting beneath their feet, and it's not coincidence. It's confirmation. You've become everything they tried to silence. Everything they tried to bury has now rooted itself in the soil of divine protection and sprouted into undeniable presence. Can they feel it now? The consequence of underestimating what was never theirs to control. Your ascent proves something profound. The divine doesn't rely on anyone's stage or spotlight to announce it's chosen. It doesn't wait for invitations. It moves when alignment meets readiness. And sometimes the silence you thought was abandonment was actually the space heaven needed to allow every lie about you to exhaust itself. You didn't need validation from crowds who were addicted to illusions. All you needed was stillness. And the truth began to speak louder than any rumor ever could. So it's time to stop labeling your exile as punishment. It was never rejection. It was redirection. It was a promotion disguised as removal. Like David being chased into caves by Saul, what looked like a setback was actually a setup. In the shadows, you were being trained for what public platforms could never prepare you for. You weren't sent away, you were pulled aside. The heavens said, "This one, we're going to preserve them." You were preserved from fake loyalty, from spiritual manipulation wrapped in guilt trips, from the shallow performance of religious politics. Like Elijah under the broom tree, you were hidden not because you were weak, but because you were too valuable to be contaminated by what was spreading. 1 Kings 19 shows that even prophets can feel overwhelmed and alone. But it was in that solitude that Elijah heard the still small voice. Not in the fire, not in the earthquake, but in the whisper. And yet, even in your protected silence, you questioned your worth. You wondered why the applause stopped, but pause and ask, since when do the guardians of illusion hand microphones to those devoted to piercing truth? Why would systems built on pretending ever uplift the one who sees clearly through the fog? They weren't shielding themselves from your weakness. They were shielding themselves from your strength. Your absence was their insurance policy. They didn't exile a mistake. They exiled a mirror. Unable to outthink you, outshine you, or outlast you, they chose the coward's path, erase the threat. But strength like yours doesn't disappear. It lingers in the room after you've left. It haunts unfinished sentences. It lives in their doubt. And now, one by one, every warning you spoke is playing out scene by scene like a prophecy they never wanted to believe. They're not quoting you now out of admiration. They're revisiting your words out of fear, because what you said is becoming reality. Every line is laced with truth they didn't want to digest. Let them breathe it in. The smoke of the castle they built on silence, now burning down to ash. You tried to steer them from the cliff. You extended grace when you owed them nothing. But some people won't hear until the floor falls out from under them. And some lessons only land after the teacher walks out. You were never meant to shout over chaos. You were meant to step back and let consequences speak. So walk with your head high, not in arrogance but in awareness. You were never meant to fit into seats that required you to betray your discernment. You weren't created to stay in rooms where truth was the enemy. Just as Jesus walked away from towns that rejected his message, you too were called to move on, not because you failed them, but because your mission was never to blend in. Think of Harriet Tubman, once enslaved, then a conductor of freedom. She wasn't welcome in the circles of power, but she was unstoppable in purpose. She once said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves." Like her, you were never here to keep people comfortable. You were called to wake them up. You were never made for crowds addicted to pleasant lies. Your soul was sculpted for holy disruption. Your blueprint wasn't for blending in. It was for standing up, standing out, and standing firm. Your so-called exile was actually a divine billboard, and across it was written one bold word: redirect. You were called away because you were being called higher. And now that you've answered, there's no going back. The same circle that once flinched at your presence, shrinking back at the force of your spirit, will soon circle back, this time searching for your compass. They once called your voice too much. Soon they'll call it necessary. They mocked your clarity before, but now, with the fog closing in, they crave the direction they once dismissed. Whether you choose to open the gate again, though, is entirely up to you. Because now the script has flipped, and the stage they once guarded like sacred ground, it's collapsing beneath their feet. They begged for clarity, and when heaven answered them through your mouth, they recoiled. They prayed for rain, and when the storm came wearing your name, they cursed the skies. Isn't it strange how people plead for breakthrough, then panic when it doesn't arrive in the form they prefer? You came without rehearsal, without sweetened words, raw, real, righteous, and they slammed the door, not because you misunderstood their request, but because you didn't show up gift-wrapped in flattery or denial. You didn't twist your truth to make it palatable. Instead, you delivered it with the authority of someone who had earned it through blood, tears, and long nights of wrestling. Just like the prophet Isaiah, who was told by God to deliver truth even when the people would not listen. In Isaiah 6:9-10, God says, "Go and tell this people, be ever hearing, but never understanding. Be ever seeing, but never perceiving." You walked in with clarity that made their masks itch, and when you refused to bend or beg, they chose blindness over breakthrough. They wanted a mirror that softened their flaws, but you held up a mirror polished to divine shine, and they couldn't escape what stared back at them. That's a classic pattern. Reject the medicine because it doesn't taste like sugar. They didn't want healing. They wanted anesthesia. They didn't want you. They wanted comfort disguised as truth. Now, the very explosives they buried in their foundations are detonating. The false cycles are combusting. The phony leaders they followed are being exposed. And the consequences? Arriving exactly on schedule. Your silence now speaks louder than the applause they used to offer out of politeness. And while they scramble for explanations, they keep returning to your words, words they once mocked, because something in their spirit recognizes that wasn't theory, that was revelation, and revelation never expires. What you spoke wasn't memorized from a script. It was distilled from the nights you cried alone, from the long wilderness seasons when no one clapped, and still you chose to listen. That's the kind of authority that cannot be fabricated by titles, conferences, or hashtags. It's the kind that comes from being pressed but not crushed, from being broken and still believing. They couldn't box you in, they couldn't pin you down. You wouldn't fold yourself into the neat dimensions of their systems. You upset it, like Jesus flipping tables in the temple. You disrupted the marketplace of performative faith. They expected their rescue to arrive with soft tones and acceptable packaging. Instead, it showed up in you, with eyes of flame and a voice that refused to lie. Your gaze refused to tolerate false peace. You didn't blink when it was time to confront illusion. You didn't trade truth for applause. And because of that, they blocked their own breakthrough. They weren't rejecting you. They were rejecting what your presence required of them. They were addicted to performance, not protection. They wanted to be reassured, not realigned. But you were never called to be a performer. You were called to be a pivot. In the same spirit, consider Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who stood against Nazi ideology even when most of the church stayed silent. He didn't flatter the powerful. He confronted evil, and it cost him his life. But today, his legacy stands taller than every name that tried to erase him. Like you, his truth was too dangerous to be accepted by a system addicted to comfort. And now, like a trumpet in the night, your silence still echoes in their minds. Every word you spoke continues to challenge their foundations, because deep down they know the one they blocked was the one sent to protect them. But heaven never begs, and grace has a timeline. Now they stand among the ruins of what they once swore was unshakable, finally recognizing that the voice they silenced was the shield they now desperately wish they had embraced. The truth you carried wasn't a disruption, it was a warning. But it came too early for their comfort. You weren't wrong, you were ahead of schedule. You didn't miss the mark. You struck before they even acknowledged there was a target. Can you see it now? That's what it means to be chosen. You show up before people admit they need saving. Being chosen often looks like being out of sync with everyone else, speaking insight before the problem is recognized, delivering answers no one wants until consequences crash through the ceiling. Like the prophets of old, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, you sounded the alarm before the disaster, not after. And just like them, you were rejected not for being false, but for being too true, too soon. Jeremiah lamented, "The word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long." Jeremiah 28. Isn't that what you lived through? You became the midnight bell, the clock chiming when the masquerade was supposed to end. And with that chime, the false peace cracked. The vibration you carried was never soft or sweet. It howled through atmospheres. ripping pretense from walls like wind tearing down banners. That's why they ran. They didn't reject you. They rejected what your presence demanded of them. Honesty, transformation, depth. You didn't spark fear. You triggered self-confrontation. Let them sit in the wreckage. Let them scroll silently now, watching your life rise while theirs unravels. Not because you wish them harm, but because exposure is truth's final punctuation. Not vengeance, just consequence. You don't have to grieve their no anymore. That chapter is sealed. You were never planting seeds for their applause. You were sounding the trumpet. You were sent to deliver the memo. You rang the bell. They skipped the lesson. And now the hourglass has emptied. You were never meant to be their comfort mascot. You were the divine interruption sent for confrontation, for correction, for revelation. And that assignment rarely comes with fanfare. It often brings whispers behind closed doors, strained smiles, awkward exits, and rolled eyes. But after all that, what follows is confirmation, and that's the season now rolling in like a tide that can't be stopped. They didn't turn from you because you lacked spark. They recoiled because you arrived carrying too much fire. You were the torch they didn't want to hold. You showed up as the solution long before they were willing to admit there was even a problem. And now, with the excuses gone and the curtain pulled back, all that remains is silence. And in that silence, your voice carries farther than it ever did in the noise. They accused you of chaos, but you were never the fire. You were the alarm, wailing before the smoke. You weren't disturbing the peace. You were refusing to let a burning building be called home. They labeled your clarity as a threat because you wouldn't rock along with their lullaby of denial. You didn't make the flames. You simply refused to sing over the sirens. When you crossed the threshold, the atmosphere responded. Tension rose. Smiles tightened. Air grew thin. You didn't bend to dysfunction, and that alone shattered their illusion of control. Your stillness roared. Their set decorations began to tremble. They weren't angry because you caused the storm. They were afraid because you recognized the thunder forming before they could hide it behind their painted curtains. You sensed the betrayal in the air. You felt the weight of secrets pressing on your chest. You carried divine alignment, even without external credentials. And that terrified a system built to blindfold its own. They slapped the label storm on you, hoping to silence what they couldn't understand, but all you did was point to the thunder that had always been echoing behind their own walls. Think of the poet and activist Maya Angelou, who once said, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." Like you, her truth-telling wasn't always welcomed. Her presence challenged systems of oppression and forced people to see what they tried to ignore. Her voice, like yours, became louder in silence, more powerful in rejection. They wanted calm, even if it was cardboard thin. They craved quiet, even if it meant suffocating the truth. But you walked in, radiating something dangerous to them: authenticity, the kind that sets fire to facades, the kind that makes masks melt. And when they couldn't unplug your warning, they tried to destroy the device itself. That device was you. But what they never understood is this: you were not the chaos, you were the clarity. And now, the world is finally catching up to what your spirit knew all along. Now the chaos is no longer lurking in the shadows. It has taken center stage, tearing the illusions down like an angry wind ripping the curtains off a stage play. This collapse didn't happen because you summoned it. It happened because they refused to listen. You weren't the storm. You were the siren trying to wake them before the storm hit. Now, relationships are unraveling, alliances are breaking, and masks are falling in heaps. The myth of unity, the performance they clung to so tightly, is cracking apart like paint peeling from a rotted wall. And in the wreckage, those same mouths that once whispered, "You're the problem," are now quietly asking, "Why didn't anyone warn us?" But someone did. It was you. You were the voice. You were the signal. The problem was never your message. It was how swiftly you spoke it, how clearly you delivered it. You didn't sugarcoat the truth. You didn't bow to their comfort. And because the vessel didn't match their idea of how truth should arrive, they rejected both the voice and the revelation it carried. Like the Pharisees who couldn't accept that the Messiah wore no crown, they tossed out the answer simply because it didn't fit their pride-driven mold. But remember, Luke 7:33-34 reminds us, "For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say, 'He has a demon.' The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, 'Here is a glutton and a drunkard.'" Truth is often dismissed because of how it's packaged. Hold this tightly. When doubt tries to sneak in, know that your unease was never dysfunction. It was divine detection. Your spirit wasn't chaotic. It was calibrated to detect poison in still water. You didn't cause the disturbance. You simply refused to swim in a current filled with corruption. And in arenas where false peace is maintained by silence and selective blindness, anyone who sees too clearly is often labeled too serious, too sensitive, or too unstable. But now the floor they danced upon is buckling. Their secrets are coughing themselves into daylight. The lies they swore were solid are splintering like dry twigs in a wildfire. And whose name is circling through their minds? Yours. That knowledge guts them. Not just that you were right, but that you remained steady. You didn't gloat. You didn't fight for credit. You simply walked away. And now, your absence echoes louder than your presence ever did. When the alarm leaves and the fire finally arrives, all pretense crumbles. The pretending ends. The sirens they once called annoying are now a haunting memory of the clarity they rejected. You were never meant to be beloved in those places. Your role was never comfort. It was confrontation. You were sent to interrupt, not to be applauded. Jesus said in Matthew 10:34, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." You weren't called to blend in, but to draw a line where darkness had blurred the truth. It was never your job to dilute your light just so others could keep sleeping in the dark. It was never your burden to hold guilt for seeing too soon, too clearly. Your gift is vision, your challenge is timing, and your reward? Watching confirmation blossom at exactly the right season. And that season is now. So walk forward, shoulders back, not in arrogance, but in honor. You weren't their favorite voice, but you were the one they needed. And now, as fire knocks at every door, that sound carries a rhythm eerily close to the truth you once spoke. A truth they can no longer escape. You didn't drag the storm in. You were just bold enough to name it. And now the world is waking up in the middle of the very thing you tried to prevent. If you feel something deep stirring in your chest right now, that's not just emotion. That's confirmation. Drop 77 in the comments and let every other chosen one feel that the shift has begun. You are not alone. You are not early. You are exactly on time. Stay awake, because what comes next will not only validate your journey, it will ignite your destiny. They saw the same warning signs you did, the forced laughter that didn't reach the eyes, the weight in the room that couldn't be named, the shift in energy that made even casual glances feel like confessions. The signs were not subtle. They were as loud as thunder muffled under velvet. The difference was you responded to them. They didn't. When the time came to stand with truth or blend into the crowd, they chose applause over authenticity. They weren't confused. They were comfortable. And comfort to them was worth more than conviction. You stood when others sat. You spoke when silence was trending. You called out the growing cracks not to cause fear, but to invite healing before collapse. And that's what terrified them. When you brought light into the room, it didn't just reveal your courage. It exposed their quiet complicity. Your bravery stripped away their excuses. The moment you raised your voice, neutrality became a myth. Every person who stayed silent was no longer a bystander. They had cast their vote for the lie. Think of Elijah on Mount Carmel. Alone against 450 prophets of Baal, he stood for the truth when the crowd bowed to false gods. The fire of God came not when the crowd cheered, but when one man dared to challenge their comfort. 1 Kings 18:22-38. Isn't that what you did? You didn't burn bridges, you lit signals. You didn't divide, you revealed what was already divided. While they clung to their positions, reputations, and influence, you carried the weight they didn't have the spine to hold. And yet, they watched. They watched you get isolated. They watched the labels stick. Troublemaker, dramatic, extremist. They watched and then quietly returned to their routines, hoping no one would question their stillness. But silence has never been neutral ground. Every shrug, every closed-door conversation, every whisper to "just let it go" was a brick in the wall that's now crumbling in plain sight. What are they thinking now as the structure they helped prop up begins to implode? As they scramble to rewrite the past, you remain where you've always been, anchored, steady, unchanged. Not because you were stubborn, but because you were grounded in truth from the start. You weren't the threat, you were the siren. And sirens are only threatening to those hoping no one notices the fire. Your choice to walk in truth, even when it cost you your comfort, is now being confirmed by reality itself. The very facts that were once called exaggerations are now flashing across headlines and whispered through boardrooms. What felt like isolation is now vindication. And the truth? It doesn't need your defense. It's defending itself. They didn't misunderstand you. They feared you, not because of your voice, but because of what your voice might cost them if they echoed it. What if they lost their place at the table? What if their names ended up blacklisted too? What if they had to walk the same lonely path you did, one paved by faith rather than applause? And yet you walked it. You endured the silence, the stares, the slander, and now your footsteps ring like an alarm bell, impossible to mute. The narrative has cracked wide open. Their revision attempts are too little, too late. As Jesus said in Luke 8:17, "For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open." Truth always rises, sometimes slowly, but never silently. Even now, some are pacing their halls, recalling every word you spoke, words they dismissed, warnings they called paranoia. But in hindsight, your voice was the only one that wasn't trying to trade integrity for safety. They wanted the benefits of your insight without the cost of your conviction. But truth has a price, and they're learning that delayed payment comes with interest. Just as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." You lived this. You didn't break because you were rebellious. You endured because you were real. Real enough to stand alone. Real enough to weep and still walk. Real enough to be branded the problem, while in reality, you were exposing one. The collapse happening now is bigger than systems. It's exposing character, not just faulty structures, but the people who once protected them, the ones who clung to privilege at the cost of principle, the ones who saw the rot and chose to look away. And what about you? Your pain, the one they tried to dismiss as oversensitivity, has become the mirror that no one can avoid anymore. You weren't sowing division, you were making a decision, and now, with the dust settling, let the record show. You weren't just ahead of the curve, you were the curve. While they preserved their polished calm, shaking hands in public and rehearsing their harmony for others to admire, you were behind the scenes, bleeding, not metaphorically, spiritually, emotionally. You were wounded in the very places where they preached unity and offered blessings. The same hands that held hymnals on Sunday left scars on you by Monday. And in their eyes, your pain was your flaw. But the truth? That pain was your revelation. Because only hurt can tear away the stage curtains. Only betrayal can reveal who really stands with you when applause disappears. Titles fade quickly when tears fall, and in your darkest moments, when your chest ached and silence answered your cries, the real faces emerged. Some whispered words of comfort laced with condescension, only to return to their gossip circles the moment you walked away. Others grinned behind closed doors, claiming your pain was karma. But you weren't cursed. You were being cleared. The universe documented every smirk, every fake hug, every passive comment disguised as concern. Even the polite, "I'll keep you in my thoughts," felt more like dismissal than comfort. Those cold moments weren't forgotten. They became silent testimonies written in permanent ink, untouched by apology. And now the secrets are flooding the streets. What was once hidden is bursting through cracks in their carefully controlled image. The same people who rolled their eyes at your warnings are now coughing in the smoke of a fire they pretended didn't exist. Isn't it strange how quickly silence turns into scrambling when consequences arrive? They're rewriting the past now, trying to act like they were never part of the problem. But records don't lie, and their distance when you needed closeness most still echoes louder than any excuse they try to offer now. And you, scarred, yes, but not broken, not defeated. You didn't just survive this season. You evolved. You turned your wounds into weapons of wisdom. You allowed suffering to shape you into someone stronger than praise ever could. They tried to turn your struggle into your obituary, but it became your ordination. What they called collapse was actually consecration. This is not the time to hand them an eraser just because they're finally uncomfortable. Let them sit with the truth. Let them remember how they dismissed the very voice that tried to save them. Your pain didn't expose your shortcomings. It exposed their hypocrisy. You were never sent to destroy. You came like a siren before the collapse, just like the prophet Jonah, who warned the people of Nineveh of destruction, not to curse them, but to give them a chance to change. You had urgency in your blood because you could see what they refused to admit. The foundations beneath them were rotting, and no lullaby could repair it. They labeled you chaos because it was easier than changing, but calm built on corruption is just disaster on delay. And when your authenticity entered the room, it rattled their whole set because everything genuine does. You didn't arrive early, you arrived on time. You were the advance notice they didn't want to hear. They mistook your warning for wreckage and threw you out to preserve an illusion that was already collapsing. But now the storm has come, just as you said. The clouds they mocked have broken open. Consequences are falling like rain. And your name? No longer dismissed. Now it's whispered with a mix of respect and regret. Your voice was never noise. It was navigation. The thunder they heard in your words was not rage. It was awakening. It was the divine impulse toward honesty that their souls weren't ready to face. You didn't show up to control them. You showed up to wake them up before the quake. And when they ran from that voice, when they wrapped themselves in a false calm, you stepped back. They thought your silence meant you gave up. But you weren't quitting. You were repositioning, stepping back from the blast zone. Like Noah, who built an ark and then stepped inside, not to run, but to preserve. You warned, you moved, you waited. And right on schedule, the storm they swore would never come arrived. And with it came revelation, exposure, divine reset. Power games, unmasked, broken cycles, snapped in half. And the favorite myth they clung to, that you were the problem, it dissolved under the weight of undeniable truth. They weren't just caught in the storm, they invited it, by ignoring the one voice that tried to help them prepare. Now, in the eerie silence of their disarray, your voice, once dismissed, mocked, or silenced, echoes through every corridor they thought would never collapse. The walls remember what they ignored. The air, once heavy with denial, now hums with confirmation. They no longer hear problem when your name is mentioned. They hear proof. Every word you once whispered into stillness has returned, not with vengeance, but with precision. You fulfilled your assignment, not to comfort, but to challenge, not to maintain illusion, but to awaken truth. They weren't ready for that confrontation, and they certainly weren't ready for its consequences. But avoidance doesn't cancel consequence. Now their panic wears like a crown, a visible signal of what happens when correction is dismissed. Don't let the pain of past rejection convince you that your clarity was a mistake. Do you remember how Noah built an ark when the skies were still blue? No one applauded him. They laughed until the rain came. What you carried was never confusion, it was preparation. You weren't asking for attention. You were tuned into the frequency of truth when everyone else was tuned to the noise of comfort. You didn't need a stage or microphone. Truth projected from your life, whether they gave you the mic or not. Let the fallout keep falling. Let the stage collapse, if that's what it takes for false peace to die. Let the empty scripts burn. If tables need to be flipped, like Jesus did in the temple courts, Matthew 21:12-13, let them flip. There is no justice in quiet agreement with corruption. And you, chosen one, were never born to be agreeable. You were sent to disrupt dysfunction. You are not their storm. You are the lesson they refuse to learn. And even now, without you speaking, without you present, your absence continues to teach. Every crashing beam, every unraveling thread, reminds them that they should have listened when the room was still. Your stillness had meaning. Your silence had weight. So walk forward, not with bitterness, but without apology. This isn't revenge, this is redemption. The validation of your obedience is unfolding in plain sight. Everything they tried to hush is now the only sound that remains. Isn't it something how the voice they muted now echoes louder than any shout? And yes, they may repost kind words now. They may suddenly remember your name when the truth is no longer deniable. Some may reach out with apologies half-filled or gestures half-hearted, but wisdom must be your filter. You don't need to hold resentment, but you do need to hold receipts. Their silence was their signature. You don't erase it just because the storm made them nostalgic for stability. You are living evidence that standing alone in truth is still safer than sitting comfortably inside a lie. Have you ever seen what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel? They refused to bow to the idol, even when threatened with fire. And yet, when they were thrown into the furnace, a fourth figure, divine and untouchable, appeared beside them. Daniel 3:24-25. That same divine presence walks beside you now. And just like the fire couldn't burn them, the lies can't bury you. The rejection didn't end you. It revealed you. Your assignment wasn't to be embraced, it was to bring exposure. And now the world is watching what happens when truth doesn't flinch. As we close today's message, I want you to reflect on this. If what you've heard today has stirred something deep within you, if it confirmed the feelings you've been carrying but couldn't quite explain, now is the time to take action. Tap like, hit subscribe, and drop 77 in the comments to declare, I will no longer shrink for spaces that fear my truth. If you know someone who has been silently bearing the weight of discernment, send this message to them. Let them know they're not walking that path alone. We see them. We stand with them. They are not invisible in this journey. Let's remember, the storm was never your fault. You were the voice of truth they chose not to hear. But now that silence has cleared, and your voice is echoing louder than ever before. To our beloved chosen family, thank you for being the reason we create with passion and purpose. Your presence, your faith, and your love keep this mission alive every day. If our work has blessed you in any way, we humbly ask you to consider supporting us through the Super Thanks button right here on your screen. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, helps fuel our passion to continue this journey. But whether you donate or not, know this: we are forever grateful for you. Thank you for being a part of this mission, for being the light in a world full of noise, and for creating space for messages like this one. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay grounded, stay obedient, and never forget, you were chosen for such a time as this. Take care, and God bless.